All right, everyone. I am here with Hamel Husain. Hamel is a staff machine learning engineer at GitHub. Hamel, welcome to the TWiML AI podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited for this conversation, and particularly because we've had a couple of reschedules due to technical issues. So, this is a hotly anticipated conversation on my part. It was anticipated prior to all that, but really looking forward to digging into the chat. Let's jump right in and have you share a little bit about what you do at GitHub.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for asking. So at GitHub, I've been doing a couple of different things. So I spent a long time at GitHub doing open source work. So I worked a lot on FastAI. So GitHub sponsored me to work on FastAI for a large period of time. And then I also did a lot of work with GitHub Actions, integrating those with different data science open source projects like Great Expectations, Jupyter, uh, Kubeflow, so on and so forth. Other than that, I've been working a lot internally on our ML infrastructure. Um, so those are kind of like different flavors of things. Currently, I'm on paternity leave, so I had a newborn 2 months ago. So I technically have not been doing anything work related for a couple of months.
I won't get I was gonna go down a rat hole and ask you how your sleep was, but we'll
That's actually surprisingly not so bad compared to my first child. So
oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Um I guess I want to kind of start out with the fast AI work that you've been doing and how that came about. But it may be useful context for you to share a little bit about your background and kind of how you came to work on the infrastructure side of machine learning.
yeah. So I started in data science a long time ago, around 2003 or so, when I graduated from undergrad. And back then, I was working uh, as a statistician predicting loan defaults for a large bank. After that, I went on to work in management consulting, doing like a data science flavor of things. Um, I had a brief hiatus where I tried out a different career, which we don't have to get into right now. Uh, and then I went back to the kind of technical consulting. And then I decided, after doing so many data science projects at different companies and different industries, I knew that the tooling was like really far behind because people always struggled with like deploying models, monitoring them, doing things in a systematic way. Um, there was a lot of open source tools, but not really good like systems. And so at that time, in 2014 or so, I was happened to be living in Boston at a time, and at that time, and there was a startup called Data Robot, which was building ML tooling. Specifically, is auto ML tooling. So they got a bunch of people that are really good at Kaggle. Uh, three or four different grandmasters, all of which were like number one at some point, and decided to bake in a lot of their best practices with regards to modeling into a product. And I thought that was really interesting. So I joined them. I learned a lot there about how to create software for data science. Uh, Spent a lot of time talking to kind of implementing these systems at different companies that are trying to use it, trying to automate some of their machine learning processes. And then I ended up moving to the Bay Area because of my wife. uh, she was doing medicine, and she's in a fellowship program, so we had to move to the Bay Area. And then I decided, I would like to experience one of these Bay Area companies I keep hearing about. Like, it's some kind of like different, you know, from the outside, Silicon Valley looks like a really different and kind of amazing experience. Uh, when you hear about it, like at least like when you're living somewhere else or you're not part of that. So I thought I have to like experience this. So I joined Airbnb as a data scientist shortly after coming to the Bay Area, and that was a really interesting experience. When I found the Airbnb, like so when I first got to Airbnb, I thought it would be really advanced in terms of like ML tooling, ML infrastructure. I thought I won't need any tools and infrastructure. They'll probably already have those, uh,
Yeah.
because it's Silicon Valley, and when I got there, um, the first project they gave to me was this model that forecasts LTV, and they said like, hey, can you just review this model? Yeah, lifetime value, yeah, for marketing, for growth marketing. And they asked me to kind of take a look at it, see if could make any improvements on the model, kind of like your first, getting your feet wet into the place. um, and so actually this particular model was a guy who ran an R script on his laptop. It spit out coefficients, and he copy and paste the coefficients into an Excel spreadsheet, which had like formulas that would like materialize these coefficients into a SQL query that he then copy and paste it into Airflow.
Wow.
And it like really blew my mind. And I thought, wow, like there's
I made
this,
it to Silicon Valley.
yeah, I thought I made Silicon Valley, and working at a very celebrated tech company. And it's like, wow, okay, like there's no ML tooling at all whatsoever. Like it's the most, it's kind of, you can't really imagine anything more basic than that. And so then I started to build tooling at Airbnb, um, and then uh, kind of got back into tooling, and then eventually, and then I created a lot of things, a lot of like artifacts that ended up being used for Bighead.
Hmm.
Um, and then after that, I ended up going to GitHub, which is where I'm at now. Um, and then I started working on infrastructure there and tooling there. Ended up working on a lot of open source stuff with regards to tooling. Um, and so at this point, I'm pretty much sold myself, or convinced myself that I will be doing ML tooling for the foreseeable future, because I keep somehow floating back into that no matter how hard I try to do anything else.
Hmm. Hmm. At GitHub, what are the main kind of use cases that ML is being used for nowadays? I mean, there's stuff that we hear about like Copilot, but I imagine that probably most of the use cases that GitHub ML engineers and data scientists are working on are kind of internal types of use cases, and then maybe not dissimilar from the kind of thing you did at Airbnb, supporting growth and kind of platform health and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different use cases at GitHub. Some of them you touched on. So a lot of forecasting of various things in terms of like infrastructure usage. Um, Also, a lot of platform health stuff like detecting spam, detecting bots of various kinds. Apparently, people like to buy stars, things like that.
Huh.
Catching things like that, or catching abuse of the
I didn't know
platform.
that was a thing.
Yeah, I didn't know that was a thing either. Seems like a pretty a low point in your life if you had to wanted to go buy stars. Um, but and then there's actually some user facing stuff that are not known so widely. So if you go to github.com slash explore, you'll see kind of a recommendation of different repositories you might be interested in, based upon your activity on GitHub. And then also, like another example is if you create a new repository, you can attach topics to it, like different tags. And so there's a small recommendation system that will recommend other tags you should apply. So there's some things like that.
Hmm.
So these are the kind of things that data scientists work on inside GitHub. And it's a pretty new thing for GitHub.
Yeah.
Uh, it's not really, it's something they're actually building up right now. It's in its most nascent stages, I would say.
Hmm. Hmm. And so, with that in mind, what does the platform look like at GitHub?
Yeah, so it's been changing quite a bit. So we were on AWS before, and then we had kind of our own homegrown infrastructure, uh, that had that was composed of using a bunch of different things like Kubeflow, and some other stuff. And then we got bought by Microsoft, and then we started transitioning everything over to Azure and using Azure ML. Um, and so Azure ML is kind of like is the managed service with that Azure provides, and it kind of is white labels a lot of ML flow stuff as well. So with regards to the experiment tracking, the model registry, and things like that, it Azure ML more or less adopts that behind the scenes, and so that's what they're using.
And so, how did your work with the Fast AI team and the Fast AI tools generally come about?
Yeah, it was really organic. So the way that happened was when I first got to GitHub. I think GitHub was still trying to find like kind of get a sense for what it wanted to do with ML. Um, there was definitely a lot of prototyping and sort of exploration of the space of like different ML projects, but it wasn't quite solidified yet. And so in the meantime, what I did was kind of do work in open source to kind of, just for fun or just kind of see, and also look for opportunities for things that might integrate with GitHub. So at some point, so I always been like a student of Jeremy's, like from a long time ago. Um, and so one of the things I ended up learning like a long time ago in one of his classes was about how to do semantic search. So he showed something in one of his classes where he had like photos of different objects, and you could search those photos semantically using natural language, but also like, even if the photo, if you construct a shared web vector space, you can create a semantic search. And so this is back in, I don't know, like 2017 or something. It was a little bit of a newer concept, and so I decided to try that out with code. So I thought that would be really interesting. And at that time, like no one has really used GitHub's public data set before. It wasn't really, for whatever reason, like I don't know, ML people have like ignored GitHub data set. Maybe it just wasn't obvious that you could get it and do something interesting with it. So the thing that's really interesting about GitHub's data set is you can actually construct a really interesting parallel corpus out of it, with regards to, so you can get a bunch of code. So like for example, Python code, you can get pairs of doc strings in code. It takes some work. You have to like get the code, clean it, and you have to parse it out. You have to parse the doc strings out from the code, and like, and then remove a lot. You get a lot of duplicates and do all that stuff. So I mean, that's a tremendous amount of work. But you can actually get a very interesting parallel corpus, and then you can do a lot of representation learning on that code, and then you can produce some things that are really interesting. So then I started to work on that in open source. And then what eventually happened is we got bought by Microsoft, and then there were some people at Microsoft Research that were interested in that. We ended up using like Fast AI in that, and that was one of the things that I think Jeremy was really excited about. Like one of the things that like an example of a use of this library in the kind of in the wild. So at first, this was my first involvement, and then at some point, GitHub released GitHub Actions, and so then I started going around to all these open source projects like Jupyter, Great Expectations, Kubeflow, so on and so forth, and started making integrations between GitHub Actions and these various data science projects. So like, um, for example, there's a project called Great Expectations that is like testing for data quality. So I thought, okay, it would be really interesting to do like CI/CD for data quality. Like, let's say if you're like updating a SQL query or something like that, like wouldn't it be cool if you had a test that could run, if you're changing SQL code in a PR, maybe you could trigger that test, things like that. So like, and then I started helping Jeremy out with his CI/CD, and then one thing led to another, and then start working on more and more things. Like once you start working on someone's CI/CD, you have to like understand like all their code, how it runs, like how the tests are run, what they mean, what's breaking, and then I started helping with this documentation.
Yeah, even going back quite a few years, they've been doing pretty interesting things like integrating in documentation and code and doing that all in notebooks as opposed to kind of traditional code files. So I imagine you got sucked into that, and that led to some of the things like MBdev and fast pages and that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah, yeah. No, that's a good that yeah. So fast forwarding, got stuck, went to a big rabbit hole on all these things that you described. Because then I started wondering, like, well, how is all this stuff created? Like, it's not that clear to me. Because actually, like they're doing a lot of interesting things using
Yeah.
a very unique tech stack. And so then I went and learned that tech stack, and then I got really involved in things like MBdev and fastcore, and started working on that. um, and then subsequently work on a bunch of other projects. So yeah, it's just very organic. Um, kind of went into a you see one thing, get interested in another thing, and it leads to something
Just
else.
pulling threads.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
So what is MBDev?
yeah. MBdev is a uh, development environment that all of FastAI is built in. And it's a literate programming environment. So the idea is you should be able to write your code in your documentation and test all in a single context, and not have to write your code in a different place, your test in a different place, in your documentation in yet a different place, and keep those all in sync yourself. But like that should be more natural. Like, hey, write some code, explain it to yourself and to your users, and then have like inside the documentation have some runnable code that explains like how this code runs, like by example. um, and then also make those tests if you can as well, but make it very natural, like a conversation with your users, and have that be run every single time your code you want to update your library, and have those tests always run. And so basically what MBdev is built on some of the things that Jupyter, for the interactive aspect of like writing code, but also being able to write prose alongside your code. So it integrates that with a static site generator that renders documentation, and then also some other tech things that export notebook code to plain, like modules, like the Python modules, like that you would write in an IDE like VS Code. So it's a system that like glues together these things to create a new development environment. There's this literate programming environment, and it's kind of hard to explain like in this abstract sense. Like I would definitely say it's something to experience, because when someone explained it to me, I was really skeptical. I was like,
It just
well,
sounds like Jupiter.
yeah. You're like, well, what do you mean like MBDev? You just write everything in notebook, and that's not really what it is. It happens to be using a notebook, but that's not
Mhm.
the central point of it. The central point of it is like it's an experience where you write. Yes, you are, in this specific case you're writing in a notebook, but you're writing your tests and documentation in the notebook with some special sugar and syntax that's available to you with for various options. And then that all gets that automatically like gets created, like documentation gets created, and tests will get run in CI for you automatically. And the result of that is like much higher quality software, and also like much lower iteration cycles. Because what
Mhm.
happens is, okay, it's like most people don't write documentation and most people don't write tests. And why is that? Because like writing documentation sucks. Like you write your code, and then now you're asking the developer to like, well, just go write this other documentation somewhere else, and then keep that in sync yourself. And like that's a pain. Like no one does that properly. Like very few people do that properly. And same thing with tests. So like it's really like it's a new development workflow, and it's like one of the secrets behind how fast AI. Like you might be wondering like how does Jeremy and like maybe one other person, depending on who's on fast AI at the time, develop all of the software. And one of the secrets behind that is MBdev, because it helps make you a lot more productive.
Yeah, like I mentioned, it does sound quite a lot like Jupiter, or maybe Jupiter with some uh, annotation types of things that let you say, hey, this is doc, this is code, this is test. But it sounds like it's more of a system than that. You mentioned literate programming a couple of times. What is that, and how does that play into what they're really trying to do with NBdev?
Yeah, literate programming is this like big concept. I don't know who invented it. Um, I'll have to look that up, but it's this concept where like your programming environment should not be dead. Like it shouldn't be completely static. You should be able to see the result of your code uh, in how that changes, inputs and outputs in real time as you're programming, and not have it be, yeah, like, and be able to experiment on the fly. Then also like prose and code should be able to be intermingled naturally, because you want to be able to like talk to your users and talk to yourself and document your code, um, beyond let's just say like comments necessarily, like, and you want to be able to kind of have this expository like form of programming where you can kind of show your code, in the same context as like writing code. And yes, that sounds a lot like Jupyter, but like it's Jupyter like with some other things to allow it to go the whole way, because like Jupyter in it by itself is not necessarily like take you doesn't allow you to do software engineering completely the way you might want to do it. Like it's not necessarily the best suited IDE just to create like Python modules in. You would have to export that somehow out of a Jupyter notebook if you're just using Jupyter. And then it's not necessarily straightforward. Like how would you write tests in Jupyter? And it's not necessarily straightforward. Like how would you create, like, yes, it looks like when you if you write a really polished Jupyter notebook, it can look a lot like documentation. But then, like, how do you actually like create documentation out of that in a systematic way, in a reliable way, and then give users a lot of different options, like how to control that documentation? Because, like you said, like you might not want to show all the code in the documentation, or you might want to show certain things, or like how do you do that? Um, so it's kind of like, that friction you feel like, and everyone may feel this, like you're in the notebook, you're developing some code, and then at a certain point you're like, oh my god, goodness, I need to take this code and make it into plain text, and you refactor it, and you're going back and forth a lot. And I think everybody's like a little bit frustrated in that process, intuitively, like, can there be a better way? But we have all learned to ignore that and just like say, well, that's just part of life. So MBdev is kind of this answer to, no, like we shouldn't ignore that. Like let's try to find a way. So by no means is MBdev perfect. It's kind of like the best kind of thing that we can have with gluing together existing technologies. But I think someone could definitely take the concept of MBdev and build something from first principles, that may work even better. But yeah, MBDev is kind of like this thing that just can work with just like kind of hacking some stuff together right now.
From the description, it sounds like, yes, it's this tool that the FastAI team built to allow them to build the FastAI library, but it can be used more broadly, by anyone for anything. Is that
Yeah,
maybe not
absolutely. Yeah.
anything, but
Yeah, I mean, it's not just for data science at all. In fact, I feel like it's been used for more regular software projects than it has been for anything related to
hmm.
data science. So, there's been a lot of like API clients written with MBDev. There's been all kinds of other software that's been written with MBDev. And so, yeah, I really think like it's a window. Of course, it only works with Python at the moment, um, but I think it's general software development. It's a development environment for general software development.
When I think about some of the activity in this space, I think of things like Netflix's Encompass, like these. And in fact, this was probably after your time at Airbnb, but at some point they were kind of going down the path of trying to like productionize notebooks. A lot of people have made attempts at that. Does Would you say that MBdev is in the same vein? In some ways, it's more like what FastAI was actually trying to do was like write books and courses and things like that more so than production software. Even the framework, the library, um, they weren't necessarily, they were authoring it. They weren't necessarily trying to productionalize it in the traditional sense of the word. Is it is there a productionalization or operationalization aspect to MBDev at all?
As far as MBdev is concerned, it is definitely about, making proper Python modules and allowing you to. I mean, it is definitely all very much about productionizing software in terms of making Python modules and packages, pushing them to PyPy, making sure you have good documentation and good CI. Because like when you start an MBDev project, it automatically stubs out like CI for you, so that it's kind of already there. And so it's very much geared towards nudging you towards productionization. Now, as far as fast AI is concerned, um, I think one of your observations is definitely correct. Like, I don't know that fast AI has been overly concerned about productionization of applications with fast AI. Like there's relative to other tools that you might see. So, for example, you know, like TensorFlow has like TFX and TensorFlow serving and stuff like that. So it's definitely that stuff does not. There's not that those kind of things don't are not there for fast AI. Um, and you're right. Like one of the things that was like really important in fast AI is to be able to have really good documentation. Um, and also like good tests, because especially like with the service area and then like only being like one or two contributors full time. And so um, one of the goals is like, okay, like the docs have to be really good because after all it is this is used for education, and if the docs are not good, people are going to get lost very quickly. But then the problem is with docs is like, how do you keep those in sync with the code when the code is changing so rapidly? Because the fast AI changes quite rapidly. They're always keeping up with state of the art things and making their own state of the art things. And so the answer to that was like, hey, let's make documentation a first class citizen. Like you should be doing it while you're writing software. Like it should be really natural. There should be no friction in introducing documentation. And so that's kind of exactly what, yeah, that's what MBDev allowed.
Yeah. And so, what are how do fast core and fast pages relate to MBDev?
Yeah. So one background of Jeremy is he has programmed a lot of different languages prior to Python. Uh, when I think he says like he says this sometimes that he's been programming every day since he was, I don't know
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah, I
Um,
was laughing because it's probably been a couple of years now, but in the TWiML community, we very early on kind of recognized the importance of what he was doing with the library and hosted um, a study group around the course. And I remember kind of vividly, my early experience with the library and other people's. And I remember making a comment on our Slack, like, why does he name these parameter names like this? Why does he name stuff like this?
mm.
And someone was like, yeah, he was a Perl contributor back in the day. And I'm pretty sure I
Yeah.
asked him about this in one of the past interviews with him. Um, but yes, he's been programming for quite a long time, and he's um, he draws a lot of inspiration from kind of classical computer science, like the literate programming is Don Knuth, and there are a bunch of other folks that like he's a big fan of APL, which
Yes.
is took a half a semester or a quarter of a semester in like a survey course in school, and it's like the only thing I remember about APL is that it had the weirdest keyboard. You had all these symbols. You basically, programming in Greek symbols with APL, and like Jeremy's super into that. So uh yes.
Yeah, no, and it shows up, and so like and he's not exaggerating when he says that because I've spent a lot of time pair programming with him, and he actually spends a lot of time hacking in different languages, even right now. And so he's what ends up happening is he whenever he uses a new language, he always like creates like a very he tries to hack the language deeply and
Mm,
create a bunch of utilities that bring in like other aspects of different like paradigms. So
mhm,
like, the one thing he misses about Python is like he wants more functional programming tools,
mhm,
or he wants more like macro, like meta programming abilities and things like that. And so that's what fastcore is. It's like hacking Python deeply to give you like some more functionality or some different types of functionality that you might want, and then he end up using that everywhere. But um this is pretty like, so if you just read fast AI code,
mhm,
a lot of it may look pretty foreign, not only in syntax but in style. uh like you said, like so there's like some things like succinctness, which he really values. He really likes to keep lines of code, like make things on one line, and the idea is to like you could see all the code in like one page, or as close to one page as possible, or something like this. And so that's where fastcore comes from. It's a very interesting, so like to understand, it was a deep rabbit hole. Like to understand fast AI deeply, I had to understand the development environment, which is MBdev. Then also to go, but then when you start to look at the source code, you have to understand like this fastcore to understand like the source code, and then like yeah, it just goes from there. So like it's pretty interesting if you're trying to like understand more about the Python programming language, like at a little bit deeper level. It's pretty interesting to look at fastcore to see like all the things you can do, and then you can like get some insight on like how some of these things are done, and it's pretty interesting. It's a way to definitely learn more Python, even if you're like using it every day.
yeah, yeah. I remember having that experience going uh through the course, like, you know hacked a little bit with Python, or kind of your typical Python stuff, right? As far as maybe calling a name function or whatever to get a list of methods or something like that. But you listen to Jeremy kind of talk about Python and work with it, and he's using all kinds of exotic dunder functions and stuff like that. That it's like, okay,
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
know that existed.
It's really interesting. Like, and then you might wonder, okay, like, well, why is this even a good idea? Like,
Hmm.
well, why does this like does it actually make this person more productive? The costs and benefits of these things. And so one thing I will say
Hmm.
is like a lot of this like actually like is in service of some kind of learning as well. Like
Mm.
doing this whole thing like is a journey of like also continuously learning the Python programming language at a deep level. And he does that like really soon. Like anytime he's frustrated with anything in Python, he'll stop, say, okay, can I like change it? Whereas like someone like me would be like, okay, like well, just let's just let's just move on, let's just do it. But then like the thing is like it adds up really fast. Like then he ends up becoming really like he ends up knowing a lot about Python like really fast.
Mm.
Um, Even like very esoteric things I would consider esoteric, like he'll know it. Like, and so I think that adds to the productivity component. But it does have the cost of like newcomers. Okay, like if you want to contribute to the FastAI library, you kind of have to learn this other thing, and so
The rabbit hole
uh,
is deep, it sounds like.
yes, yeah, very deep, yes, yeah.
So that's fast core, fast pages.
One thing that is really important is I find as a data scientist is writing blogs. Like it's It's really useful to like share your knowledge. And so, whenever I've written blogs before, um, I used to use Medium, and like you always want to, a lot of times you want to put code in your blogs, but then the process of writing is not linear. Like you start writing it down, and you're like, oh, actually this code, like I don't like it anymore. Like maybe I'm doesn't really make the point that I was thinking, or whatever. And then you change your code, then you have to like copy and paste all your code again into this thing, and then like update your words around it and like update the output, and you're like, this is a big mess 'cause you're like copy and pasting constantly. And then you're like, you realize like, why am I doing this? Like I'm a programmer. Why am I copying and pasting like charts and graphs and things into this thing so I can like write a blog post? Like, doesn't make any sense. Like,
Hmm.
if I'm changing, can I just like change all of this stuff with code? And then you also realize like, hey, there's like Jupyter. Like, I can write word. I can just run a Jupyter. Like, isn't a Jupyter notebook like a blog? Like, can't why can't a Jupyter notebook be like a blog? Like, it's
Hmm.
pretty obvious. Like, and then I started looking around. Like, how do I turn a Jupyter notebook into a blog? And actually, there was not good answer for that. It's like,
Hmm.
well, like it was like very hacky, like nothing really worked very well. There's some like here and there different things. I said, look, I just want something that just like I save a notebook somewhere and it just becomes a blog. And then I have some ability to like hide cells and show cells and do some things like that. And then so I took some of the ideas from MBdev with regards to how it renders docs. And I said, well, why can't it just be a blogging platform?
Hmm.
Um, and then all the conversion process and all that, can you just automate that with GitHub Actions? Can we have like triggers that say, okay, when you update something in your repo, it just re-renders the notebook and reprocesses it and makes it into a page? And so that was the general idea of that. It was just like making it easier for you to write your blog as a notebook.
I've always appreciated how Weights and Biases does that. They have a nice implementation of being able to kind of blog your experiments and things like that. Is it in a similar vein?
Yeah, I really like weights and biases too. One of my favorite tools. It's similar to that. I would say weights and biases is more of a, you don't really have to write any code really. If you don't want
Hmm.
to, you can just start typing like a Google Doc and put stuff in there. The
So
thing that's
Fast
really
Pages at a lower level.
yeah, I said lower level. It's like you make a proper Jupyter notebook and you save it. Um,
Okay.
weights and biases, the visualization layer is a bit different.
Hmm.
They're not really necessarily using like Python in there. It's like some other syntax.
Hmm.
Uh, and then you can use Vega and something like that to create custom visualizations, and it's kind of this middle ground.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a bit different, but similar, kind of a similar genre, I guess.
Hmm. Hmm. And then you mentioned GitHub Actions in, well, you've mentioned it a few times, but most recently, kind of as a part of the Fast Pages process. Talk through GitHub Actions and some of the ways you've used them to support data science.
Yeah. So the idea is like, can we have CI/CD in various like data science workflows? Like, does it make sense? So, for example, while we're talking about weights and biases, um, so one integration that I've made is something that will, uh, ping weights and biases for experiment tracking results and bring those into the PR and render them in the PR, so that you can view them and then have a discussion. So the idea is like, the example that I showed was, you make a PR against some modeling code. I don't know if you've seen PRs like this, but I've seen a lot of different PRs that where someone makes a change to a model, and then what the review is like, hey, like what happened? Does it make the model better? And the response is, yeah, it makes it better, and you just merge it. But like, that is broken. Like we know that's broken. Like we can't do that. We can't have this like, this like hearsay conversation about code. Like, yeah, it should
Right.
be something that's very like more objective. And
Hmm.
so the idea is like, okay, like can you bring your experiment tracking results into the PR to accomplish, to like bring more visibility into the results of a workflow? And there's a lot of different nuances there. Like I don't want to just give you the impression it's just like something is triggered on every push or something like that, just like normal code. Like machine learning is a little bit different. So the idea is like, is there an integration that makes sense? And those are the kind of things I worked on. For example, there's another thing where there's a project called Repo to Docker that takes like any repository, like data science repository, and Dockerizes it. And this is for the purpose, like this is what Binder uses. Like if you try to go to Binder and like give it a GitHub URL, what we'll do is like it'll give you a Jupyter notebook, but it'll try its best to like build the dependencies by introspecting your repo.
So you don't need the Docker file there. You're just, giving it a typical Python repo. Maybe it has a requirements txt file, and it's gonna figure it all out.
Yeah, it'll try to guess. Like it'll, as a hierarchy, like it'll look for a requirements.txt file. If it doesn't find that, then it'll like look for a conda file. If it doesn't find that, it'll like look for something else and look for like these things. And like, you know, it also supports Docker files, or if you have that, it'll look for that or do whatever. But a lot of people don't have that stuff. Like a lot of data scientists just have requirements.txt or something, and you want a reproducible environment. So it's like, okay, can you have GitHub Actions automatically build that for you and deploy it somewhere? So that's being used. GitHub Actions, and so the GitHub Action is interesting because like you can pre-package them and like make them modular. So like this weights and biases thing, like you don't have to, like you can just call the weights and biases action and like say, okay, like you give it like some like 3 or 4 parameters to get it working. You don't have to like use all of the code that I created for to ping the weights and biases API. Similarly, like for this Jupyter example, usually you just give it like whatever parameters. Like let's say you're trying to push this thing to a Docker repo, this image that you automatically build. You just give it like your Docker credentials and off you go. You don't have to like, so like that's that's the kind of power of GitHub Actions, is like you don't have to worry about the complexity of these things. You can just use them in your workflow.
Got it. So high level, you've got uh, various life cycle triggers on the GitHub side, whether that's code being pushed to something or a new comment in an issue, and then the action itself kind of encapsulates integrations with other things, and so you can basically hook all your other things into various stages of interacting with GitHub.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good explanation.
And then, so some of the ones you mentioned, did you mention actions for great expectations? Yeah. What does
Yeah,
that
yeah, I
one
did.
do?
Yeah. So let's say you have like a SQL file in your
Hmm.
repo. You can set up an action to trigger, like if you change the SQL file, let's say, and then you want to validate the data that is like emitted by the SQL file, or maybe it's even a table definition that you have in your GitHub repo. You can have that validated by great expectations, and then you can have the action like tell you whether it passed or failed the expectations check. And if it fails, you can actually have it place a link to the dashboard
Mm.
that great expectations produces. um, and things like that, so just make it a little bit easier for you as a data scientist, like when you're doing something, to have it more integrated, uh, where it makes sense.
And maybe kind of wrap things up. Do you have visibility into kind of the direction that Jeremy and the team are headed with Fast API? I'm wondering, like, what you're excited about there, or what you're looking forward to taking on once you're back from paternity.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I haven't, I've tried to stay true to my paternity leave and try to not pay too much attention to the outside world. It's been hard. But I actually don't know, to be honest with you, like
Hmm.
what necessarily they're going to focus on the most. I would actually have to talk to Jeremy
Yeah.
to ask him about that, to be honest.
Um, what 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 was on your list of things that you were kind of looking forward to and excited about before you left? Do you remember?
Yeah, so I was actually looking. So one thing I've been really like interested in is like the explosion of different ML tooling out there
Hmm.
and how this space is going to evolve.
Yeah.
Uh, and um, and then also like I was looking into like because like how I mentioned that GitHub is moved onto Azure and using Azure ML. I was actually looking at all these different alternative workflow tools for ML.
Hmm.
And so I was exploring a lot of them, and the one that I was most excited about so far is Metaflow
Hmm.
from the Netflix team. So uh, yeah, that's one of the things I've been playing with most recently. So we'll
Nice.
see. Maybe I will do something in that with that project in the future.
Nice. I interviewed recently Vile Tulos, who is the founder of that. He's no longer at Netflix. Now he's kind of doing a startup based on Metaflow. So um, you know, I'm sure there'll be lots of opportunity to dig into what they're up to there.
Yeah, yeah, there definitely is, and yeah, I've been talking to Vile as well with a great interest, and so yeah, I think that's a really I'm really excited about that project.
And what in particular, out of curiosity, you mentioned all of the projects that are out there. There are a ton of projects out there. What in particular about that one catches your interest?
Yeah, so a lot of projects that are out there. So like before this, I was actually involved in Kubeflow,
Hmm.
um, and then I've also used MLflow because of Azure and things like that. And so one of the things that really impresses me about Metaflow is where how they meet the user where they are.
Hmm.
And so what I mean by that is, for example, Kubeflow kind of tells the data scientist, "Hey, you should learn Kubernetes."
Yeah.
Um, they may not say
Also,
that
it's easy.
explicitly, but that is definitely like lurking in the room.
Right.
And ultimately like that makes it can make it very difficult for
Hmm.
adoption. It's kind of like saying, hey, like I want to drive this car, but I need to have a mechanic sitting in the passenger seat next to me the whole time.
Hmm.
And like, no, I don't want to drive a car. Like I cannot drive a car like that. Like can I
Right.
just drive a car? And so you know I think with a lot of the Netflix infra uh like that you see, it's kind of different, like in terms of they try to meet the user where they are. Some
Hmm.
might argue they try to meet the user too much where they are, maybe like with this notebook infra. I actually think that that's really cool. Like maybe some of those things are like experiments to try to see how far they can push the envelope. Either way, I really like the whole notion of meeting the user where they are and
Hmm.
thinking about what like the user experience looks like. And so like their APIs and their workflow, the design of the API is very intuitive, and it doesn't require the user to really learn some like galaxy brain thing like Kubernetes. Um, and I think that sounds really simple, but I don't see that really that many tools do that.
Hmm.
Um, Now MLflow is there too, but I feel that MLflow is behind in a lot of their features versus Metaflow in this regard. Um, and I'm not a big, their API is something that I don't find as intuitive.
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, that's it. I mean, this is like it's an open source project that seems like it has good traction. I really like their API. I like their philosophy of meeting the user where they are. Um, yeah, and so that sets them apart. So yeah,
Cool.
I'm excited about it.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Hamel, it's been great catching up with you. Excited we finally got to record this conversation, and thanks for joining the show.
All right, thank you for having me.
Thank you.